Amy, I wanted to start by talking about something that I know that you've commented on previously, which is the feminization of the academy. I actually wrote an essay recently about not just the feminization of the academy, but I think the feminization of public life. And I offered you as a counterexample of a woman who is participates obviously in public life as an academic, but who is not is temperamentally quite different. I think it's fair to say from the average woman on certain important metrics, which means that you are not, I think, an example of this. But nevertheless, I think you agree with me that there is a wider phenomenon where certain feminine traits are being expressed within public culture with both good and bad consequences.
Yes, I've spoken out about this on a number of occasions. I agree with you. It hasn't just infected the academy, although the academy has a particularly bad case, but the wider culture, institutionally and attitudinally. Feminism has its upsides. I have benefited from some of them, but it also has tremendous downsides, and that we need to acknowledge. So what am I complaining about? First, let me affirm what you're saying, which is I don't consider myself a typical woman. I so often get responses like, well, you're a woman and you've reaped tremendous benefits from what feminism has brought. And I say, well, you have to understand that women, like all groups, fall onto a bell curve. The fact that someone is speaking about something doesn't mean that they're typical in every way of the category they're talking about. I think one wonderful book about this with a deadly title, something like Work Lifestyle Choices in the 21st Century, really soporific here, by a wonderful sociologist, a British of Iranian extraction named Catherine Haykim. And I keep returning to this book because it's really brilliant. She says there are, and there always have been, a spectrum of distribution of women. There's the very domestic primary women who are very conventional in their interests and orientation, very domestic in their tastes. There are women on the opposite end of the bell curve who she calls blue stockings. And of course, there was an era where if they entered intellectual or public life, they had to forego the conventional female roles of marriage and family. So it was an either or. Nowadays, it's not. And then there's this middle group who combine some interest in vocation with domesticity, and they tend to be the most biddable for whatever norms happen to be adopted by society at the time. But I consider myself a blue stocking. Even though I have 3 children, I'm, heavily heterosexual, exclusively heterosexual, that I am feminine in many ways, I think. My interest is heavily careerist, and my way of thinking is, I have been told many times, masculine. All right, so that fits uncomfortably with academia today. So what is the feminization of academia all about? Just to, summarize it, and I have summarized it this way, it's the elevation of the values of the nursery and the kindergarten over the traditional, established, customary values of the academy, which have been a long time in the making of, and are predominant in the West, of course, of truth-seeking, of rigor, of, empiricism, of, disagreement, sportsmanlike, rigorous, vigorous disagreement and argumentation and reason, and all of that. And women, not just women, but also, minorities as well, that's sort of a third wheel here that's turning, have questioned those values, and I think actively sought to undermine them in their kind of safetyist, anti-free expression, anti-First Amendment ethos, which, isn't just rooted in feminism, but in a much broader far left ideology. that is critical of, paternalistic values, masculinity in general. It's really a sweeping critique. And those people have gotten the upper hand. One very recent example, because this just, we think we have seen a shift since October 7th, but the old ideas refuse to die. The Harvard social science dean, Lawrence Bobo, just said, academics who cause scrutiny and criticism of our institution, whose statements elicit that attention, they're not protected by academic free expression values or, First Amendment values. They've betrayed us. They're going to be punished. I mean, that's safetyism, kind of writ large. And it's the insularity. We need to protect people from upsetting ideas, bad ideas. We need to draw lines so that we can maintain, our control and maintain a sort of warm bath atmosphere here at Harvard. That whole attitude, which sells First Amendment values, open expression values down the river, or demotes it. I think this is a matter of re-scrambling the hierarchy, really, of what's more important and what's less important. And that has a pervasive influence on academia today. And we see it in the wider society, of course.
Do you think that there are any advantages to the feminization of these institutions?
Very few. I think, one aspect that I have spoken of is the fairness element of opening institutions to people from whatever background, whatever gender. That wasn't the practice decades ago. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. It applies not just to women, but also to minorities. The problem is when those people come in, they bring in their values and their prejudices and their priorities, and then they insist upon implementing them as a kind of lemma or corollary of being allowed to enter and participate and compete. The whole idea of competition is, of course, under attack. And I have stated, and I still believe this, maybe I'm naive, people tell me I am, I just don't get it, that the men who had control of the academy and, dominated it, really in recent times, this phenomenon is just decades old, I think, the feminist takeover, the feminization. They should have resisted. Still don't understand why they gave in so readily to these demands and these values. I guess the short answer is they were as captured by this left-leaning ideology as, they are lefties. I mean, academia is a stronghold now of far left ideas. Wonderful essay recently in National Affair by Steve Tellis, who's at Johns Hopkins, who, acknowledges this, brings together all of the social science and materials that show that this is the case. And I guess they just either felt they couldn't resist, lacked the confidence to resist, weren't sure about whether the critique held any water. There was a lack of cultural confidence there. Personally, I think a lack of manliness, frankly, although people bristle when you use that term, to resist. You don't push back against the ladies. Well, you have to, especially when the ladies come to the fore. They don't stay in their separate sphere. You have to say, I'm sorry, girls, but you're not going to get your way on this.
I suppose this is one of the sometimes subtle ways in which women have always had power in society. We have power through men, right? That men will often find it difficult to. There's an urge to impress women. There's an urge to be,
Accommodating.
yeah, and obviously with exceptions, but a lot of men have that sort of yes, they will behave differently when women are around. And this is one of the ways in which women have always had often invisible but nonetheless important modes of power.
It's the
Um,
downside of chivalry. And
right.
I mean, chivalry was kept within bounds because women were kept within bounds. I mean, let's be quite clear, there were many restrictions on women, collective restrictions on women and norms that held them back. And once those dissolved, chivalry became dysfunctional, because it goes too far. It's funny because one of my favorite expressions, and when I teach my students, I teach a course in conservative political and legal thought, which, is quite a heavy lift of a course there. But I always quote Lord Patrick Devlin, who was a conservative jurist in Britain in the late part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. He said in his debate with H.L.A. Hart, and there's so much wisdom here, fornication will never be wiped out. Well, back then, fornication was considered, very undesirable. It will never be wiped out. The key is to keep it within bounds.
Mm-hmm.
And that expression, to keep it within bounds, is such a wonderful, useful, all-purpose trope for how we ought to govern our society, and how we ought to govern academia, our institutions, vis-a-vis the demands of, the preferences of any given group that stood outside but now comes in to the equation. So yeah, men were in charge, but see, I have no problem with men being in charge because I see civilization as primarily the product of male efforts, imagination, drive, ability. I think it still is in many ways, and I think it will continue to be. So, to channel Camille Paglia, if we didn't have men, we'd all be sitting around in grass huts beating on tom-toms. They're the ones who've taken us out of that and created this glorious prosperity, the systems that we enjoy and take for granted. I think we ought to be a lot more grateful to men, show a lot more gratitude to men for their strengths and contributions than we do now. Of course, that's very unfashionable.
I don't disagree. I mean, I'm thinking about this question of sort of how do we respond to the feminization of public life? Because I agree with you that there are some very destructive consequences, particularly within the academy and particularly within some disciplines. Um, One more optimistic view is that women have been in these roles for all of 5 minutes in historical terms. This is a very, very new phenomenon. And to some extent, we haven't yet learned what the failure modes are of female dominated institutions or even 50-50 institutions, because historically they just didn't really exist. At the moment, obviously, there's this enormous taboo on even talking about the fact that men and women are psychologically different from one another on average. But if we were to surmount that taboo and we were to say, okay, here are the ways, here are the failure modes for feminine institutions, here are the ways in which women will tend to misbehave in various ways in the workforce, in the same way that men will sometimes misbehave in the workplace. So the counterpart I think of sometimes is that, say, there is a tendency within women to be cliquey, to be bitchy, to be indirectly aggressive in destructive ways. We know this. Similarly, there is a tendency within men to be sexually exploitative at work and to be sexually inappropriate. And, if we could just recognize these as kind of um, the the two key weaknesses of male and female, where men and women in the workforce, and stigmatized the bitchiness in women in the same way that we stigmatize lecherousness in men. Do you think that might be one way of having functional mixed sex institutions?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would take issue with your term bitchiness because I think that doesn't capture women, the havoc that women have wreaked and continue to wreak on institutions society-wide. They bring a once again, different set of priorities and values that work within the spheres to which they were previously confined. They were the nurturers. They were the ones who, were supposed to empathize and bring compassion and unconditional love and try and be, make all the kids equal and that sort of stuff. I mean, obviously they didn't do that perfectly. They valued camaraderie. Well, that's really a masculine term, but getting along with people, a sort of a kumbaya atmosphere of, faux consensus, and truth-seeking, which can be very bruising and very hurtful and upsetting. That, isn't up there. So that is incredibly destructive, I think. And needs to be pushed back against very, very vigorously. Now, so I think the situation is worse than you make it out to be. There's, a lot of havoc that's been wreaked by feminization. There's also, of course, the whole other element, which you write about in your book, of male-female relations, which are, quite vexed now, quite difficult, because of attitudinal polarization, political polarization, feminist demands, feminist skepticism about men, their nature, their contributions, the compromises that women have to make to live with men, everything imaginable. I was just thinking today, this may seem like far afield, but it's really not, of the rather funny phenomenon of a few married women saying to me, my husband wants more sex than I want, and I struggle with that because on the one hand, what's the big deal? On the other hand, I don't want it. And it gets me thinking about women's nature. I think, this is my theory, women have evolved to experience unwanted sex, even too much sex in a marriage, right, as very dysphoric, as very aversive, more aversive than objectively it really should be, for evolutionary reasons, because they are the picky sex. They don't want to be, put upon by men who they consider undesirable fathers. So this is a kind of knee-jerk reaction that they have, right? So going back to my main point here, women, in adopting, I think, a counter-natural hookup culture, some of the attitudes they've developed, denigrating their gatekeeping role on, social norms and male behavior, except as it's channeled through Me Too, which can be very destructive. They have, I think, kind of wrecked male-female cooperation to the point where we have plummeting marriage rates, plummeting birth rates, all of these phenomena, shrinking populations. That's the wages of feminism as well, not exclusively, but part of it. Now, in terms of taming men and all their bad impulses, they have lots of them, right? The bitter and the sweet, that is the story of masculinity. And, predatory sexual behavior is part of their evolved nature too. But, for all along, we have had norms in place, which have worked imperfectly, of course, of gentlemanliness, of, Judeo-Christian norms about monogamy and marriage and what it means to be a good husband, and a proscription on physical violence. I mean, all of this stuff is considered aberrational, not quote unquote acceptable. Once again, it doesn't always get tamed. The Me Too movement is in part a result of that. I think the Me Too movement has gone overboard in destructive ways. If you will read this interesting 3-part article in the Wall Street Journal a week or so ago about this law professor named Josh Wright, who was the darling of Silicon Valley because he would do their bidding and argue their points of view about antitrust, but he had a wife with 3 kids and was balancing 3 or 4 mistresses, mostly his students and ex-students. Okay, and I read this article with skepticism because some of these students and ex-students carried on affairs with him for years. And then when they're spurned, they turn around and accuse him of predation. They didn't feel like they could leave him because he had influence. Well, that's like generic. I mean, men can hurt you if you piss them off in a romantic relationship. That's a commonplace. But there's some bad faith there in these women turning around and accusing this guy and trying to get him into trouble. So there's a spectrum here of our modern response to men's cattishness and bad behavior, which I think requires some nuanced distinctions. But, shifting over to the female side, I think we need to hold some lines there and make some distinctions. And I don't see them being made in the academy and in any opinion-shaping institution, frankly. I mean, female priorities is such an important part of wokeness. And it spills over into minority priorities, right? Because they want inclusion, belonging, they want to feel good. That means feeling good at all times and never hearing any criticism of them. It's really gotten to that point. I'm telling you. Criticism is hurtful. Women say, oh, philosophy colloquia, where people duke it out, and it can be really harsh. I've participated in such. Oh, we have to get rid of that. We have to get rid of, no holds barred, pull no punches, criticism, and social commentary. That goes too far. On both sides, I think the solutions are worse than the disease. The cures are worse than the disease.
I think that the feminization of public life thesis goes a very long way towards explaining a lot of modern social and political phenomena. I think, for instance, I've said this on the podcast a couple of times, that I think that the destigmatization of homosexuality is almost certainly a consequence of women's influx into positions of influence, because women are just less homophobic in general. So I think there are definitely some phenomena which are very easily explained this way. And to some extent, wokeness comes under that. But it's a bit complicated because if you also look at women's participation in other political movements historically, women have often been involved in very conservative movements.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I agree with you. Women have been a conservative force, for a long time in their role that they accepted, or pretty much were constrained to accept, as the protectors of the family, the sort of assistant to the captain of the ship, as James Stephen would put it. They ceded their role of leadership. But parallel to all of that, of women's sort of preservative conservatism, have always been these radical women, these, women who want to just upend the patriarchy and the establishment and everything that goes with it and start all over again. And they've been absorbed into this broader paradigm of wokeness, which is the world is oppressor and oppressed, the establishment, the customary ways of doing things and everything that goes with it, free markets, rights, blah, blah. You could make a list. That's all just a cover for power and the exercise of power and tyranny and despotism on the part of men and the male establishment. That goes back to John Stuart Mill's On the Subjection of Women and before, right? So there are many threads that come together for those attitudes. Yeah, they've always been there.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. I wonder if one explanation as to which kinds of political movements women involve themselves in is life cycle. Because if you look at some of these conservative movements, like Prohibition springs to mind. That was a very female-led
Yes.
campaign. Um, I mean, in some on if from can be compared with wokeness in some ways, in that it's about suppression and control, but also is clearly very conservative in other ways and was very bound up with the church and so on. It wasn't so very long ago, and to some extent this is still true, that there was this stereotype of the church ladies, the cliquey,
Sure.
controlling local gossips who were very, very pious. So, but almost always these women involved in these conservative movements are mothers and grandmothers.
Mhm.
And often they're doing this once their children have flown the nest and they suddenly have a lot of free time. And this is one way in which women can channel their energies in later life.
Mhm.
Whereas now, generally, the women in the academy and media and so on who are most invested in wokeness tend to either they don't have children or they haven't yet had children. Do you think that might partly be explaining the different characteristics of these female-led political movements?
This is a complex cultural phenomenon, once again, with many different sources. I think even the church ladies of old, the ones who spearheaded Prohibition and the like, they were fundamentally conservative in many of their habits and, their kind of bourgeois values, in part, I think, because of the roles that they played or were constrained to play. But there was a absolutist commitment to virtue above all in the Prohibition movement. I mean, the Prohibition movement is so fascinating because it just contains so many elements of female thinking that we see now, right? This kind of Pollyanna-ish optimism about social control and the potential for social control, the importance of this sort of utopian vision of perfect virtue, which is at the heart of progressivism, of course, to enshrine that and to kind of downplay or ignore the compromises that surround drinking alcohol. We're not going to think about men's need for this safety valve, the camaraderie, the ethnic element of German culture, and all the complexities of a social life that get lost in this fervor of absolutism, which really was the Prohibition movement. And now we've just translated that fervor. And you're right, it's young women now, which I think is just socially unbelievably dysfunctional because women in this age group should be, forming families. It's very short-sighted as well. A lot of it is generated by the spread of higher education, the expansion of higher education, which has been an underappreciated trend in our society. I was just reading some statistics about, how in 1970, something like, which is the year before I went off to college, something like only 9% of the population had a BA, some tiny percentage. Everybody else just had a high school degree, so they hadn't yet been exposed to this hideous propaganda machine, which is higher ed. And frankly, and this is not a popular point of view, only a very small percentage of the population is equipped to really benefit from higher education. Charles Murray, in his book Real Education, which is a wonderful book, estimates it at about 15%, based on IQ and the level of cognitive ability that you need to, do college level work and learn the skills and conceptions that they're shoving at you in college. So we have a bunch of people with degrees who really, think that they're some kind of expert or elite. And they learn in college that, do-gooder activism, changing the world, appending traditions and established practices, that has tremendous cultural prestige. You hear it everywhere. And, I say to my law students, and I'm considered like a total thorn in their side and countercultural person, mostly by my colleagues in the administration, not so much by the students, because the ones that approach me are actually curious, right? I say, your first job is to be professional. That means preserve, protect, and defend the system that we have built. But don't throw the whole thing over, right? It's the best we have and the best the world has produced. That attitude of gratitude and reverence towards the system that has been created, the sacrifices that have been made by our progenitors, our ancestors to create this, that is never taught. That is just considered right wing quack, right? And that, is very pernicious, and that is the ethos that women imbibe. And my experience, this is anecdotal, is that the women fall for it hook, line, and sinker. The men do too, but they're more skeptical. There are more men who question the, status quo dispensation of ideas that have made their way into the academy. Because the women love it. It has a certain emotional appeal, right? We're going to help people. We're going to make things better. We're going to enshrine progress as the ultimate good rather than preservation. Because the past is ugly, it's evil. It needs to be discarded as soon as possible. Well, that's the whole progressive shtick, right? Now updated to woke. And there they go. Out they come. Right? And they're trying to do all of this. There are a million different pathways they can take to do it. All these organizations have grown up to absorb, this excessive elite class, as Tolkien and others have described it, and make them feel useful and virtuous.
Do you think that it would be better if we returned to the status quo of, say, the 19th or early 20th century, and not only did very few people go to university, but of those who went to university, very, very few were women? Do you think that, sub 5% of university students should be women?
Well, ideally, but I'm not sure how to get back there. You have to, as I read another essay, I guess it was the Worthy House website, nostalgia is, pretty silly. I actually don't agree with that. I think reactionary is an honorific. The problem is at this point in society, it's just not going to fly to say we're going to identify a certain category of people and then keep them out in a formal way. One way we can do that is the meritocracy. That has actually the effect of screening out a tremendous number of minorities and blacks, of course, something that people are very reluctant to face up to when they tout the meritocracy. That's a whole nother topic. But when it comes to women, they're good little students. They get high scores. Now, whether when they actually get out into the real world, they contribute as much as men do is, I think, yet to be proven. because men are the bold innovators, men are the risk takers. And so when you combine that with ability, that's where you get Western Civ, right?
Mhm.
How are you going to say we only want 30% female law students or 20% female med students because that's better for the profession? People used to say that, by the way. There was a kind of quota.
Mhm.
I tell my students, if you go back and read the tracts against women getting the vote and women being emancipated into these male roles, and, such publications exist, my right-wing young friends know about them, they make all of these arguments about feminization, erosion, endangering the family and male-female relations. All of these arguments have come to pass. All of this stuff that they predicted has come to pass. But they lost the debate, right? We're now awash in this kind of enlightened egalitarianism, equalitarianism. So I don't know that you can go back to manipulating the percentage of males and females in these roles. One way you can affect the pipeline is, being serious about the meritocracy, being serious about rigor. For example, in academic medicine, that's a field I know because I have family members in it. Men disproportionately produce the research that's worth producing, not, the fake research about disparities and all this soft medical sociology stuff. And if you just looked at, the old parameters of productivity, contribution, etc., the pipeline would, leak women. Now, it does anyway, right? But it would leak it even more than it does now. So just once again, I'm back to maintain the rigor and the practices and the old-fashioned standards of your profession or your, sphere or the labor market, and women will drop out. That's already happening, and is no indication, there's no guarantee that if it happens more, masculine values will come back to the fore and be openly embraced, because they've just been so toxic. They've been depicted as so toxic. It's really ridiculous because it's so one-sided. What's taught in school is just so one-sided that there's a taboo against praising manly accomplishments, the virtues of Western Civ, which is, of course, what they've produced. Just one more anecdote before I shut up. When I took my son and our family to Holland for a vacation, we went to a Concertgebouw concert. If you've ever been in the Concertgebouw, and there are a lot of performance spaces like this, it has on the lintel the list of all the great composers throughout history, and not one is a woman, And I said to my kids, I'm such a terrible mother, why is it all males? I said, well, I don't believe it's because women were kept down, because during the period when these males were writing this glorious music, women learned music. They learned to play instruments. They were exposed to music of all kinds. And it's not like doing science. All you have to do is get a piece of paper and write the music down. No one was stopping them from writing the music down if it was running through their head. And I said, you know what? They didn't write it down because it wasn't running through their head. And, my son quoted me years later on this when he had a Twitter account. And really, you would never say that. You would be, well, my institution is attempting to penalize and sanction me for saying these very sorts of things. But how can you deny it?
I think is it called the male variability hypothesis? This idea that men just you see more men at the male bell curve is broader, and you see more men, say, who are intellectually disabled, and also more
Yes.
men who are geniuses, and
Right.
more men who are extraordinarily creative,
Right. And
etc.
prolific.
Yeah, so that probably goes quite a long way towards explaining things like classical composers being overwhelmingly male and Nobel Prize winners being overwhelmingly male and so on. But in the sort of upper chunk of the bell curve, but not the tippy tail, you do see plenty of women, and this is
Yes.
what we have seen in terms of the influx of women into professions like medicine, which is now majority female in terms of students, and actually parents. You may have seen some of the same survey data I have, asking parents and grandparents what they most desire for their children. This is, I
Hmm.
think, in America. And parents will overwhelmingly say that actually what they really want for their children, for their sons and their daughters, is professional success and
Hmm.
economic success. They don't care that much about having grandchildren. I find this very surprising, but a lot of people will say they would rather their daughters were professionally successful than that their daughters had children. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that goes a long way towards explaining why parents have proved very eager to send their children to send their daughters to university, to see their daughters enter these elite professions. I mean, I think you have two daughters, is that
I
right?
have two daughters and a son, yes.
Did you encourage your daughters to go to university?
Well, I mean, it was just a given, you know.
Okay.
I mean, we're Jewish. It's like, you're going to college. That's just part of our culture. We didn't really talk about it. My daughters actually went to a very fancy prep school. My son refused to go, quite wisely, I think. But he went to a fancy college. This was, of course, before wokeness had really. My kids are now, 30 and a little bit older, so they missed all of that. My daughters, though, I mean, first of all, I'm astonished that people prioritize career success over, marriage and family and grandchildren. And I would only explain it. I don't know how deep those surveys go in terms of social class, because you always have to watch that sort of thing and scrutinize it. But I think a lot of it has to do with wanting their daughters to be secure, because marriage and family is no longer the route to security. I mean, for some people it is, because of the volatility of these relationships. So, you don't want to see your daughter end up impoverished as a divorcee who's never worked. That's a bad situation, right? So, a lot of it is that. And I acknowledge, let's take science, the life sciences, women are, quite distinguished. I am not denying that. I am absolutely not denying that at all, or saying that women should not go into these fields. Let me just summarize really very simply what I am saying. I am saying there will be women in previously masculine fields, X, Y, and Z, but there just will be fewer of them. You are not going to get, without a lot of social coercion, sort of double standards, dishonesty and manipulation, 50-50 at the very top. If you have anything like, a free society where you don't put, a heavy hand on these phenomena, you will not get parity. And I think that's okay. That the notion that it's okay that we're not going to get parity is one that, has yet to be sold. It's really a hard sell, but the push for parity, I think, wreaks havoc. It is maybe one of the most destructive social trends. Let the 20% of physicists be women. I mean, big deal. I don't lose sleep over that. And let, a higher proportion of the very tippy top of the bell curve, the truly outstanding people, be men. Let it be. Let it happen. I don't see why people are so upset by that. Well, they're upset because of ideology, because they believe that, any disparities are socially constructed, that women are just like men. They share their tastes, their abilities, their drive, whatever it takes to reach the top. Having 3 children, I see what the combination is to get to the top. It's not just IQ, right? IQ is big. Nobody's denying that. I don't deny it. But it's not the only element of the persona. So, and you know what? I would translate what I just said, which is there will be some, there will be fewer, QED. And, you know, Larry Summers got fired for saying that. James Damore got fired for saying that. I would translate that over to lay minorities and blacks because, you know, we have data that blacks have on average lower IQ by a pretty significant amount. And that is going to translate in a meritocracy that is, you know, pretty much colorblind, which I think in employment spheres it should be. I'm not so idealistic to think that colorblindness can invade all spheres, but education and employment, for good reason, we should be colorblind and have a single standard. We will not necessarily get parity, you know, and that seems to be a fact that people cannot deal with.
Sticking with the gender issue for now, although I want to ask about race as well, because that's, of course,
Mm-hmm.
the subject of your disciplinary process that you're currently going through. Um, I agree with you, and I think that listeners will overwhelmingly agree with you that just removing affirmative action would be fine, and that just let the attrition happen. If women want to leave these professions because they want to have children, fine. If women don't get to the top of physics, engineering, whatever male-dominated field you want to name, fine. I agree. I wonder though if, given the ambition that parents clearly have for their daughters, given the evident eagerness that women have to participate in higher education, and the fact that women on a lot of metrics outperform men, right? At least in terms of being conscientious workers and sort of achieving in particular kinds of ways. I agree with you about things like the adventurous, the risk-taking, the innovative will overwhelmingly be men. But in terms of the good girls who do their homework, women are actually really great at that generally. Um, do you not think that in order to actually return to a more masculine higher education, more masculine private public sphere in general, and also what we haven't really mentioned yet, in order to have higher birth rates, because I think we both agree that there is a fundamental conflict between women pursuing professional success and women pursuing family. Do you think that actually we would have to do more than that? There would have to be more significant either stigma or barriers put in the way of women? Like, would you think that that level of intervention would be justified in order to return to a more masculine public life?
No, I think it requires a normative and cultural change. I think
Hmm.
it's in the head. A lot of this is in the air and in the head. You know, it just going back to me being countercultural, you know, I said to my daughters, you need to be married by 30 and you need to have children. And, you know, there's never a good time. Whatever your professional ambitions might be, just muddle through. I mean, I give them very practical advice because when you're 50 years old, you will be glad. They never see their life sort of as a whole. They never go and view the entire trajectory. It's really a strange thing that women are not encouraged to. They're encouraged to be very short-sighted. You know, I think my husband puts it well in his typical laconic way. Rare is the woman who can reach the end of her life childless without regret. And rare is that woman. And I don't think that's going to change. So we're setting up for a lot of unhappiness. Now, you are absolutely right. You know, having children and, you know, gearing for professional success at the very top of the food chain, they collide. I can attest to it. You know, I did that. I mean, my whole life was delayed. I would have had even more children, I think, if I'd gotten an earlier start. I mean, I was very much infected by, you know, the zeitgeist of you have to get career success and only then can you have your children. So my last was born when I was 43. I was really lucky. But I say to my students, you're not going to be lucky. Your infertility is a misery, and it starts at 30. You know, that's when your fertility is plummeting. Yeah, does it create difficulties? Absolutely. For that tiny number of really ambitious women, who are fewer in number than you think, right? They really are. You know, those super women, some of them work it out. And I give them practical tips, you know, throw money at the problem. Don't be afraid to get help, lots of different kinds of help with your children. Take a more aristocratic attitude towards mothering. I mean, this intensive mothering ethos is just a killer. That's socially constructed. I mean, that you have to be hands-on and in there every single second. I confess that was not my mothering model. And my kids turned out great. But that's, you know, that doesn't prove a thing. There are ways to beat the system if you are so inclined to beat the system. But I don't think at the end of the day, a lot of women are happy beating the system. And in practice, you know, you see a discrepancy between what women actually do, some women, and the rhetoric. There's more of a convergence in that I see birth rates plummeting. I see marriage rates plummeting. That disturbs me. I see my own students not prioritizing finding a mate, are dating and, you know, having all sorts of sexual adventures, even participating in the hookup culture, which I consider an abomination, frankly. But I'm showing my age here. They don't go out into the dating market and say, I want to get married. I am looking for a man to marry. I am looking for the father of my children. I mean, you know, that is the message I gave to my daughters. That is what you need to start looking for now. All right. And my son. And I think they got the memo in that within a year and a half, they'll all be married. So that's not a message that people are willing to impart to women. Oh, that's right wing. Right? How many people in authority will say that? Without saying, oh, you should go home and be barefoot and pregnant, because nobody's saying that. I'm not saying that. But there's nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mom, right? Absolutely nothing. And of course, at the top end of the bell curve, you know, there are tons of stay-at-home moms. There's a sociologist at Harvard, and of course I'm blanking on her name. Her first name is Sasha, who has a very interesting database. She's very quantitatively driven, where she uses one of these, you know, longitudinal surveys to look at how women are dealing with motherhood. And what she finds is less than a majority of women are working full-time continuously if they have a child, or one, or two, or three. They are stepping out of the workforce. They are either working part-time or they are leaving altogether. You know, being a blue stocking is a minority venture. It's you know, people say, well, you've just benefited. Look what you've done with feminism and everything it's wrought. I said, yeah, but I'm atypical. Most women are not like me. We have to gear our society to what most women are like, what will make them happy, and, you know, what is best for society as a whole. We have to balance all of these things, and not just, you know, look anecdotally at ourselves. Now, back to one thing you mentioned, parents state the same ambitions for their daughters as their sons. I think that's, once again, driven mostly by, well, it's driven by pride and, you know, cultural ideas about what's worthwhile. I mean, all of that stuff is in the mix. But when you actually have your children in front of you, you know, the 2 or 3, you are basically going to take the attitude, I want them to be happy. I want them to do what is going to make the best life for them. And you're going to, if you have any sense at all, you're going to gear that to who they are. What parent says, well, I know that you want to get an art history degree and work, as a curator or at a gallery or something, be a gallerina, but I think you should be a physicist. You need to be a physicist. I did have I had coffee with one of a junior candidate long ago when I was allowed to do this for our law school. She was actually a woman of Indian extraction, continental India, very accomplished. And she asked me about my children. I said, well, my son is an economist, PhD in economics. She said, that's what I want my daughter to do. I want my daughter to be an economist and get a PhD in economics. I said, good luck with that. I mean, nothing you do or nothing you consciously do is going to get your daughter to do that if she doesn't want to do that. So, a lot of parents accept their daughters not necessarily taking the right tail of the right tail role. And frankly, a lot of sons too. I mean, what are nice Jewish boys doing these days? They're not going into medicine. Precious few are going to law school. They're certainly not getting PhDs in economics. They're, very few. They're probably making films. Some of them are going into finance, I guess. Maybe they're going to nonprofits. I mean, you have to deal with what's in front of you. So, these stated ambitions, which are socially desirable, social desirability bias, what Brian Kaplan calls driven, and the pragmatic adjustment to the actual people that you produce are radically different.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.